I always thought some things were meant to last forever. The house you grow up in, for instance. It's more than just a building, it's where every wall holds a memory, from your first steps to the birthday parties and quiet moments with family. That house is supposed to be yours, a safe place that stays in the family, right? At least, that's what I always believed. But when my parents sold my childhood home, I was blindsided. The place that meant everything to me was suddenly gone. I never saw it coming. The house, the anchor to my past, became just another piece of property on a real estate list. I remember sitting around the dinner table as a kid, hearing my parents promise that the house would always be ours, that no matter what happened, it would stay in the family. Those promises meant the world to me. So when I got the call years later, telling me that the house was sold, I didn't know how to react. Hurt, anger, betrayal, they all hit me at once. My parents had made a decision without me, and I had no say in it. But I wasn't ready to just let it go. I needed to get that house back, and I was determined to find a way. The only question was, why did they sell it in the first place? What happened to all the promises they made? It was time for me to find out, and nothing was going to stop me from bringing that house back home. After the shock of learning that my parents had sold the house, I spent weeks in a daze, trying to understand why they'd made such a drastic decision. The house had been in our family for generations. Could they just let it go? It wasn't just the building itself that hurt me, it was the memories tied to every inch of that. I couldn't just let it slip away without understanding why. So, I confronted my parents. I wanted answers. I sat them down, and the conversation that followed was nothing short of eye-opening. When I asked them why they sold the house, I could tell they weren't prepared for the question. My dad hesitated before admitting that they had been struggling financially for years, and selling the house was the only option they saw at the time. I was shocked. My parents, who I thought had everything under control, had been hiding their financial troubles from me. They were embarrassed, and I could see the regret in their eyes. They said they didn't want to burden me with their problems, and that's why they never told me. I could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on me. It wasn't just about the house anymore, it was about family, trust, and all the things I hadn't realized were happening behind closed doors. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. I knew that life had its ups and downs, but selling the house didn't feel like a solution. It felt like they were giving up. I couldn't just accept. So, I made a decision. I would buy the house back. It wasn't just about getting the property back, it was about reclaiming something that felt like my identity, my heritage, I didn't care how long it took, or how difficult it would be. I was going to fight. I began researching everything I needed to know about buying property, taking out loans, and getting the necessary financial backing. It wasn't going to be easy, but I was ready for the challenge. This wasn't just about buying a house, it was about proving to myself and to my parents that I could turn things around and bring back what was lost. Once I made the decision to buy the house back, I threw myself into research. I was determined to understand everything I could about the real estate market, mortgage options, and how I could leverage my financial situation to make this work. The first step was finding out who had bought the house. I reached out to the real estate agent who had facilitated the sale, and after some convincing, she gave me the name of the new owner. It turned out that the house had been bought by an investor, someone who saw the value in the property, but didn't know the emotional weight it held. It felt like a punch to the house that had been so sacred to me was now just another asset to someone who probably had no idea how much it meant to my family. I tried to reach out to the investor, but at first, he didn't seem interested in selling. His response was cold, businesslike. He had no reason to part with it, especially not at the price he'd. I wasn't going to give up though. I knew that if I could show him that I had the financial means and the right intention, I might stand a chance. So, I spent the next few weeks doing everything I could to improve my financial position. I tightened my budget, cut down on unnecessary expenses, and even took on some extra freelance work to boost my income. It wasn't glamorous, but it was necessary. I knew that if I wanted to make an offer, it had to be strong enough to get his attention. After months of hard work, I was finally able to save enough for a down payment. But I wasn't done yet. The real battle was negotiating with the investor. I made an appointment to meet him face to face, hoping that showing my determination would sway him. When I walked into the office, I could tell right away that he was skeptical. He looked me up and down, almost sizing me up as if he was wondering what I had to offer, but I wasn't intimidated. I calmly explained the significance of the house, how it had been in my family for generations, and how much it meant to me personally. I spoke from the heart, hoping he would see the passion behind my words. Surprisingly, the investor listened. I could see that he wasn't entirely unaffected by my story. Still, he didn't immediately agree to sell. Instead, he made a counteroffer that was much higher than I had expected. I knew it was going to be tough, But I also knew that I couldn't back down. I took the counteroffer to my bank, and after a lot of back and forth, I was able to secure a loan that would allow me to make the purchase. It felt like the final hurdle, and once the loan was approved, I felt a surge of adrenaline. It was happy. The house that had been a symbol of my childhood, the place where so many memories were made, was finally within reach. The day the sale was finalized was nothing short of surreal. I still couldn't believe it. I had officially bought back my childhood home. But the hardest part wasn't the financial struggle or the negotiations, it was the moment when I had to tell my parents. I knew they were still reeling from the decision to sell the house, and I wasn't sure how they would react. But when I showed them the paperwork, their eyes widened in disbelief. It took a few seconds for them to process what had just happened. And then, they started to cry. My dad, who had always been the strong, silent type, looked at me with a mixture of pride and guilt. "You did it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You brought it back. I never thought we'd see this place again." It was the moment I had been working toward for months, and it felt like all the hard work, all the sacrifice, had finally paid off. The moment my parents realized that I had bought back our childhood home was one of the most powerful and emotional experiences I've ever had. It wasn't just a victory for me, it was a victory for them too. My father, who had always been the practical one, was in disbelief. For years, I'd heard him talk about how he wished things had turned out differently, how he regretted having to sell the house. I could see the weight of that regret on his shoulders every time he visited the property, every time he mentioned it in passing. But now, standing in the foyer of the house that had shaped so much of our lives, all of that weight seemed to lift. My mother, on the other hand, was the one who had truly held on to the memories of that house. She would talk about the garden in the backyard where I'd spent hours playing as a child, the kitchen where she'd spent countless evenings cooking for the family, the living room where we'd gathered during holidays. For her, the house wasn't just a physical structure, it was a symbol of everything we had been, everything we had lost. Watching her step inside once again, after all those years, was like seeing a piece of her soul come alive again. It was like a reunion, not just with the house, but with the past. We spent hours walking through each room, rediscovering the spaces that had meant so much to us. My father went straight to the garage, where he used to work on cars, and for the first time in years, I saw that familiar glint in his eye, the one that came with doing something he loved. My mom immediately headed to the garden, running her fingers over the plants that were still there, the ones she had planted when I was a child. It was like she was connecting with the memories we had left behind. And I was right there with them, seeing everything through their eyes again. It wasn't just my dream to bring the house back, it was theirs too. They had never truly let go, and neither had I. But as we spent more time there, something unexpected began to happen. The house, which had once felt so full of life, seemed empty. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. It wasn't just the fact that it had been empty for a few years. It was something deeper, something I couldn't quite explain. The rooms felt bigger, the walls seemed quieter, and the air was still. It was as if the house had been holding its breath, waiting for us to return, and yet, there was an undeniable emptiness. It was hard to ignore. Maybe it was the fact that so much had changed in our lives since we'd left. My parents were older now. I had grown into a different person, one who had seen the world and experienced things that I couldn't have imagined back then. It was a strange feeling. On one hand, I felt like I had reclaimed a piece of my past, something that had slipped away from me. But on the other hand, I realized that no matter how much I wanted to turn back time, I couldn't. The house was still the same in many ways, but it wasn't exactly the same. The years had changed it, just as the years had changed me and my family. There was a bitter sweetness in that realization. But even so, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. The house may not be the same as it once was, but it was ours again. And in that moment, I knew that the past, no matter how distant it seemed, would always be with us. As the days went by, my parents and I spent a lot of time in the house, just soaking in the memories. It wasn't about fixing things up, or turning it into some perfect version of what it used to be. No. This was about reclaiming a space that had been left behind, about reconnecting with the essence of who we were before everything changed. There were so many things I had forgotten, small details that used to fill every corner of our lives. Like the old creaky floorboard by the kitchen sink where my mother would always stand while she cooked dinner, or the cracked window in the attic that had been my secret hiding spot as a child. These things didn't have any real monetary value, but they held something far more important. They were pieces of our history. It was during one of these quiet moments that my mother said something that stopped me in my tracks. She turned to me with tears in her eyes and said, "You know, I always hoped you would bring this house back to us. I didn't think it would ever happen, but I always hoped." Her words hit me harder than I expected. I'd always known how much this house meant to her, but hearing her say it out loud, after all these years, made the weight of that dream clear. It wasn't just about bricks and mortar. It was about the life we'd lived, the people we'd been, and the family we had built together. I think at that moment, I understood something that had been elusive for so long. The house wasn't just a structure. It wasn't just a place to live, it was a living, breathing part of our family. And by bringing it back, I wasn't just giving my parents something material. I was giving them the chance to relive the best parts of their lives. I was offering them a second chance to experience the warmth, the laughter, and the comfort that only home can provide. It wasn't about fixing the house. It was about healing the wounds we'd carried for so long. The house might not have been perfect anymore, but it didn't need to be. What mattered was that we were together again, in the place where it all started. As the weeks passed, I found myself spending more and more time in the house too. The quiet moments, the long walks down the old streets, the evenings spent sitting on the porch of it started to sink in. I started to realize that I wasn't just living in a piece of the past. I was creating a new future. The home was no longer just a reflection of what we had lost. It was a canvas for what we were about to build. I began to make new memories in the rooms where old ones had lived. It wasn't always easy. There were moments of doubt, moments when I felt overwhelmed by the weight of what I was trying to carry. But every time I walked through the front door, I was reminded of why I had fought so hard to bring it back. It wasn't just about a house. It was about the people who lived in it, and the strength of a family that never truly let go. But as powerful as all of this was, I couldn't ignore the reality that things were different now. My parents were older, and so was I. Life had changed us all, in ways we hadn't anticipated. There were moments when I realized that we couldn't go back to the way things were. We couldn't relive our childhood or undo the decisions that had led us to this point. But perhaps that's what made the return to this house so meaningful. We weren't trying to recreate the past. We were accepting the present, with all its imperfections, and moving forward from there. The house wasn't a time machine, it was a place where we could heal, grow, and evolve together. In the end, buying back our childhood home wasn't just about reclaiming the past, it was about finding a way to move forward while still honoring where we came from. It was about understanding that the pieces of our past, even when they've been altered or lost, are still a part of us. And maybe, just maybe, we never really lose the places that shaped us. They live on in the choices we make, in the memories we carry, and in the people we've become. My parents couldn't believe that I had bought the house back, and honestly, I still can't fully believe it myself. But in a way, that disbelief is exactly what makes this story so powerful. Because, sometimes, the greatest victories are the ones we never thought were possible. The months following the decision to buy the house back were filled with a whirlwind of emotions. Some days felt like I was moving mountains, while other days felt like the weight of everything was pressing down on me. But through it all, one thing kept me grounded: the feeling that I was doing something more than just fixing up a house. I was rebuilding the very essence of my family's legacy. Every nail I hammered, every wall I painted, every corner I cleaned, felt like an act of love, a tribute to my parents, to my childhood, and to everything we had been through together. I'd learned so much during this journey. I learned the importance of resilience, how we can take the pieces of our broken past and, with time, turn them into something beautiful. But more than anything, I learned about the power of home, not the structure, not the walls or the floors, but the feeling it evokes. Home is where we find ourselves, where we find each other, and where we are able to return to the most authentic versions of who we truly are. This house was never just a building. It was the heartbeat of our family, pulsing with memories, love, and even grief. Then, one evening, after another long day of repairs, I sat down on the same porch where my parents and I had shared countless sunsets years ago. The air was cooler now, and the light was beginning to fade. I looked out at the quiet street and felt a deep sense of peace. It wasn't a perfect peace. There were still unfinished projects, unresolved feelings, and unspoken words between my parents and me. But somehow, in this moment, the imperfections seemed insignificant. We were here, together, and that, in itself, was enough. My mother came outside and sat down beside me. She didn't say anything at first, she didn't have to. She just sat there, gazing at the horizon with me. It was the first time in a long while that we simply were together, without the need for explanations or apologies. Sometimes, words aren't enough to express what we feel, and silence can say more than anything else ever could. My dad joined us moments later, his steps slow but steady. The three of us sat there, side by side, watching as the sky turned from orange to purple, and the stars began to appear. My mother broke the silence after a while, her voice soft, almost as if she were speaking more to herself than to us. You know, when we sold this house, I never imagined we'd be back here like this. Her voice wavered with emotion. I never imagined I'd be sitting here again, with you, feeling like everything's finally right again. I didn't know what to say at first. I could feel the lump forming in my throat. It was hard to find the words, because this moment was so much bigger than anything I could articulate. But then, I did what I always did when I didn't have the right words. I just let the silence wrap around us. We didn't need to talk to understand each other. There was a deep, unspoken bond between us that no words could explain. As I looked at my parents, I realized something. The journey we'd been on wasn't just about reclaiming a house, it was about healing. It was about breaking the cycle of hurt and disappointment that had been passed down for generations. It was about understanding that it's okay to feel lost. It's okay to be broken. But it's not okay to give up. We had stumbled along the way, but we had never truly let go of each other. And in this quiet, perfect moment, I understood that this house was never the goal. The true victory was the healing we'd found in each other's company. The true victory was in this moment of peace. It wasn't easy to get here. There were so many times I felt like I couldn't keep going. There were moments of doubt, fear, and frustration. I had moments where I questioned my decision, where I thought it would have been easier to just move on to find a new home and leave the past behind. But there was one thing that kept me grounded through it all. The belief that I could give my parents a sense of closure, a sense of peace, that I could take something they had lost and give it back to them. That was my promise to them and to myself. And now, as I sat with them on that porch, I realized that promise had been fulfilled. The house wasn't perfect, we hadn't fixed everything. There were still cracks in the foundation, and the wallpaper in the hallway was peeling. But those imperfections no longer mattered. They were just part of the story of us, of our resilience, our love, and our ability to make things right even when the odds were against us. It was a story of victory, not in the way the world typically defines success, but in the way that truly matters. The victory of coming back home. My father looked at me then, his eyes soft, the wrinkles around his eyes deepening as he smiled. "I don't know how you did it," he said. "But I'm so proud of you." His voice was steady, but there was a quiet emotion there that I hadn't expected. "I never thought we'd see this place again. Not like this." I smiled back, but the truth was, I didn't know how I did it either. There were so many times I doubted myself. So many times I felt like I was fighting a battle I couldn't win. But here I was, sitting with my parents, in the house that we had all once called home. I didn't need to explain the journey. It was written in the spaces between us, in the way we shared this moment without needing to say much. My heart swelled with pride and gratitude. Not just for the house, but for the people in it. For the family that had carried me through every storm. And for the love that had never truly left, even when it seemed like we were drifting apart. It wasn't about the house anymore. It was about the people who filled it. The house was just a backdrop to the real story, the story of a family that had endured, and found their way back to each other. As the evening stretched on, the air cool against our skin, I realized that this house would always be a part of me. No matter where I went in life, no matter how far I traveled, it would always be the place where my story began. It would always be the place where my parents' story began too. It would always be our foundation. The stars were out now, twinkling above us like tiny, distant promises. And in that moment, I knew that the greatest victory wasn't in buying back the house. It wasn't in the material possession of the walls and the roof. The true victory was in the journey we had taken together through loss, through heartache, and through a kind of rebirth. We had come back home, not just to a house, but to each other. And as I sat there, side by side with my parents, I realized that home isn't just a place you live, it's a place you build. Home is where you heal. It's where you find your roots, and it's where you grow. And sometimes, it takes a long time to find your way back. But when you do, when you're finally sitting there in the silence with the people who matter most, you realize that all the pain, all the struggles, all the obstacles, it was all worth it.